When I was 18, my life took a harsh turn. My parents and twin sister decided there wasn't enough room for me at home, effectively forcing me out. I spent the next several years grappling with instability, moving from makeshift living situations, including a tent, to getting by however I could. Despite these struggles, I managed to build a stable life and eventually bought my own house. Now, at 26, just as I've established myself, my family, led by my sister who's expecting her fourth child, suddenly reappeared. They arrived unannounced at my doorstep, looking to move in. This is the same sister who had once advocated for my ouster, claiming our home was too small for both of us. Growing up, I constantly felt sidelined in favour of my sister. Our parents made no secret of their preference for a daughter. They even admitted they would have chosen not to have me if my sister hadn't been conceived. Throughout our childhood, she was the centre of attention. Her needs always came first, from toys to clothes, while I received the bare minimum to keep up appearances. My sister has always exhibited narcissistic traits, likely a product of our parents' biased upbringing. She's been a continual source of distress for me, undermining me at every opportunity instead of providing the sibling support one might expect. This toxic family dynamic was somewhat mitigated by our grandfather, the only family member who saw through the unfair treatment. His passing when I was 15 removed the last bit of kindness I experienced at home. As teenagers, when my sister became pregnant, our parents married her off to her boyfriend and brought him into our already cramped home, leaving me without even a couch to sleep on. My father used the living room couch occasionally, so that wasn't an option either. With no alternatives and explicit instructions not to reach out to relatives, as that would expose our family's dysfunction, I was pushed out entirely. I ended up in a tent in our backyard, a solution that came about after the police mistakenly brought me back home following a brief stint of homelessness. This setup was a so-called reward for keeping quiet about my actual living conditions. Years of hardship and determination led me to a better place, both physically and emotionally. Now, as my family attempts to encroach on the life I've painstakingly built, I find myself at a crossroads, contemplating how to handle their unexpected and unwelcome return. They offered me a place to live in their backyard, on the condition that I clean it up first. I agreed, despite the area being in disarray, scattered with flour, sugar, and infested with rodents thriving on the mess. At one of the lowest points in my life, I saw this as an opportunity and quickly moved in, even though my sister seemed relieved to see me go, remarking on the lack of space for me at her place. No one cared to ask where I was heading. Cleaning and transforming the space into a livable area wasn't easy at first, especially dealing with the rodents that sought out the scattered food. However, I eventually settled in comfortably. My circumstances forced me to drop out of high school just a few months shy of my final exams. My friends advised me to stay in my parents' backyard and finish school, but I had already given up on that path. Instead, I focused on my job, relying solely on my earnings. Before long, I realized the need to enhance my skills for a better future. Growing up, my father was a service technician, and I often played with his tools instead of toys, helping him with various household repairs. This early experience came in handy when I decided to invest in further education and secured a job at a car manufacturing plant. I worked diligently, climbing the professional ladder until I became a design manager. Recently, an old friend in the midst of a divorce needed to sell his house quickly. Despite my initial reluctance, the substantial discount and flexible payment plan he offered were too good to pass up. I bought the 4-bedroom house and moved in 3 weeks ago. To my surprise, my estranged family showed up unannounced at my new home. Considering I had no contact with them for years and lived 17 miles away, their visit was unexpected. I suspect a neighbour, still connected on social media, might have informed them. Upon their forceful entry, my parents expressed pride in my accomplishments, but it was surreal for them to see me as a homeowner at 36 while they still rented. My sister and her husband wandered around as if they were assessing the place to move in. When confronted, they vaguely mentioned they were just checking on me. Ironically, they seemed interested in my life now when I needed them least. During their visit, my sister audaciously claimed a bedroom for herself. enthused by the private bathroom, as if it was settled that they would move in. My parents tried to reason with her to manage her children better amidst this chaos. I was flabbergasted and firmly refused any discussions about them moving in. The conversation escalated quickly, with them trying to impose a moral obligation on me to house my sister due to familial duty. In a heated moment, I stood my ground, emphasizing that my parents had the responsibility to provide for their children, not me. I demanded they leave my home, asserting my independence and refuting any guilt they attempted to place on me for their lack of planning and space. As they left, I realized the peace of living alone in my own space, free from the burden of uninvited and unwelcome expectations. Back then, my grandfather was fine with my cousin sleeping on the couch, but when I asked for a similar favor, he denied it and kicked me out. I vented about how I had struggled, living with rodents in my employer's garage, and then in a cramped apartment for 10 years, but my family never once checked on me. As I recounted my hardships, my mother began to cry and tried to hug me, but I stopped her and insisted they leave. John told me to toughen up, reminding me of his own hard times, suggesting I had plenty of space in my big house since I was single. I sharply told him to be quiet. My sister cursed at me for raising my voice at her husband, but I stood firm and told them to leave, or it would escalate. I ushered them out, refusing to let them argue back. My anger was palpable. They had always been toxic and self-centered, and now their greed was showing. I was no longer the compliant teenager they once manipulated. If they pushed further, I was ready to involve the police. To clarify, no, my sister never offered to pay rent. She and her husband had been sponging off my parents for over a decade, and now they seemed intent on leeching off me. Despite the strain it clearly put on my parents, they never took steps to push her out. Instead, they tried to unload her onto me. A week after our initial confrontation, my mother visited again. This time she was direct, arguing that my home had enough room to house my sister and her family. She repeated her reasoning about the crowded conditions at her place, but I remained resolute with my refusal. When subtle persuasion didn't work, she resorted to thinly veiled threats, suggesting that my large, often empty house was a security risk, and that having family around would be safer and help with chores. I dismissed her fears and her manipulations, telling her firmly to leave and not return. Just days after our argument, a neighbor alerted me to suspicious activity around my house. He described seeing a pregnant woman, a man, and a young boy peering into windows and lingering in the backyard, likely trying to break in. Grateful for his vigilance, I gave him my contact information and asked him to keep me informed. My plans to install security cameras had been urgent, but not soon enough, as just 5 days later, the same neighbor called to tell me he thought someone had broken into my home. Rushing back, I discovered he was right. My sister and John had entered through a rear window. Confronted, my sister justified their break-in by claiming they had no other choice, accusing me of being unreasonable. As I processed her audacity, John smugly remarked on how easy it had been. I lost my temper and confronted him physically. My sister tried to intervene, and during the scuffle, their teenage son hit me with a bottle, causing my head to bleed. The situation escalated quickly into chaos, and my sister called our parents, painting a picture of me as the aggressor. When the police arrived, they began to clear up the mess while my sister and John frantically apologized, pleading not to have their son arrested. Despite their pleas, I was ready to pursue charges for everyone involved. My sister, however, denied the break-in and assault, claiming it was merely a family visit gone wrong, and that her son's actions were just a prank. As my parents arrived, they pressured me to drop the charges, uniting to defend my sister and label me as vindictive. Faced with their collective denial and manipulation, I was determined not to let them rewrite the narrative of what had occurred in my own home. Last week, my neighbor stepped forward to provide a crucial statement, which ultimately led to the arrest of those involved in my assault. They spent the night in jail because my parents couldn't afford bail. The following morning, they faced trial while I was at the hospital treating my injuries and ensuring there were no internal damages. I took a few days off to recover and press charges for assault, also seeking compensation for my legal fees, which the court granted. Despite my parents' efforts to persuade me to drop the charges, I stood firm, even threatening legal action against them for their involvement in orchestrating the attack. Given that their son is a minor, he was treated under juvenile law, resulting in a week's stay in a juvenile facility, with his parents liable for restitution, lost wages, and my medical expenses. My sister and her husband were fined heavily. In an attempt to lessen their financial burden, they requested to substitute part of their fine with community service. It's been quiet since the incident. I hope they've learned their lesson and will maintain their distance. However, my parents haven't let this go. Just yesterday, they showed up at my doorstep. After persistently waiting outside for an hour, I reluctantly let them in. They pleaded for my help, but when it became clear they were asking on behalf of my sister, I refused to be involved. They then revealed their real motive. They're aging, their home is deteriorating, and they wanted to move in with me, expecting me to take them in out of duty. I confronted them about their lack of responsibility as parents. They mentioned handing their house over to my sister, seeing it as another tactic to impose on me. They even suggested she could pay rent to stay in my house, which I could use towards my mortgage. I firmly declined, stating that my sister needs to manage her own financial challenges without my involvement. As they continued to plead, suggesting the house was too large for just one person, I made it clear that my future plans did not include remaining single or accommodating them out of obligation. Their attempts at emotional manipulation didn't sway me. I reminded them of their past actions and how they had once treated me, emphasizing that I would not be guilted into compliance. Their strategy to use familial ties to their advantage was clear, but I remained resolute in setting boundaries to protect my well-being and future. After my parents left my home, looking visibly upset, I closed the door behind them. Despite whatever names they might call me, I resolved not to yield to their demands or let them walk over me. Now, on to another challenging episode in my life.